This is Dialogue, a weekly conversation where creativity meets technology. This episode of Season 1 is brought to you by Astropad and Hello. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hey, John, how are you?
I'm doing really well. You know what? That first half of our discussion with Pierce Brown was fascinating to me. I really enjoy hearing about writers who do something that's so much different than what you and I do. I mean, writing fiction, writing dialogue, writing long-form writing, it's all, I mean, you, of course, are familiar with long-form writing a little bit, I suppose.
Just a little.
So we're just going to jump right back into it, Federico, with the questions and follow up with where we left off with Pierce Brown. So here we go.
All right. Before we talk about Dark Age, I want to ask you about your writing process. So far, we've learned that you don't like doing these huge outlines.
I wish I did. It'd be nice to, but I just can't.
So how do you actually get started? Like Iron Gold is finished. You got to plan the next book. What do you do?
I sit down with the pen and paper and I try to outline. And then eventually I'll give up on outlining and then just start writing it because I'll literally build up so much tension that I have to write it. And it's more like I get inspired by scenes. So as I'm exploring, the outline, I'll see what I'm really doing is kind of painting the room. I'm populating the room with furniture, with characters, with setting, and what do I want to see in the universe? Where haven't I explored yet? What do I want the theme of this book to be? And often I won't even have the theme of the book until my second draft. So the first draft is always me exploring, like, where do I want to go in this world? It's almost like a Rick Steves documentary. Like, do we want to go to the outside rim? Do we want to go to Mercury and see how life is there? And so for me, it's an act of exploration. So it's literally just like turning on the engine and then letting it go wherever it wants to go, and then hopefully getting inspired.
And what's the role of technology in this stage? Do you actually? I mean, you don't
Hopefully
write the book by hand. So how do you actually?
I don't write it by hand.
Okay.
So I write either by my laptop or my desktop, though I also started using my typewriter because I find that I start editing myself too much and slow down because I'm, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And I let perfect be the enemy of good all the time when I'm on a computer because it's too easy to edit. It's too easy to read. So I've recently switched over to typewriter and I'll just type it out and then I'll transpose it later on during the day. And that's part of the editing process, What's that memorization trick? They make you write it down a couple times, like 6 times, and it helps you remember it. That's basically what I'm doing now. So I'll write it on the typewriter and then type it up later on in the day and then make my edits and then hopefully leave it instead of like writing for 12 hours. Because if you're on a computer, there's no end time. There's no, I'll write like 5 pages. No, you keep writing because you feel lazy if you don't. So you keep writing, you write all day, and then your life quickly becomes 2-dimensional. And the only thing that exists is the book, and that's not when it lives. So I'm trying this analog way. I'll let you know how it goes.
We're very familiar with sitting in front of a computer all day, and the how that can be kind of a sinkhole.
I bet you guys are, yeah. You know how you kind of like you can stretch any task to fit a day. So like if you don't have a deadline, man, you can make that small task last all day, and you like trick yourself into thinking, oh, I'm looking for inspiration online. Oh, I'm going to watch this trailer to get enthusiastic about the arts, watching the new Justice League trailer. I'll watch it twice, and then you'll find something else to do and you'll just procrastinate endlessly. What's really hard to procrastinate in front of? A typewriter. It's just so hard to procrastinate in front of a typewriter because it's staring at you accusingly saying, I'm only good at one thing. Make me click. And so you're like, all right, I'll punch the keys. And then you have no other thing there. You don't have your phone with you. You don't have your computer with you. And so then it becomes like, all right, I'm going to do this for 3 hours. And then I want to get out because it's not like totally emotionally rewarding because I can't just pull up a YouTube video. And then you're done and you've done your work and you've done as much work as you would in the 10 hours you spent in front of your computer. At least that's what my mindset's been lately.
So when you sit down in front of your typewriter, do you set a goal for yourself, whether it's how many pages you're going to type up or whether it's how long you're going to write for before you end up, doing the editing in the afternoon or something? How does that work out?
Yeah, I did the page thing, but then I found that wasn't very good because I wouldn't reach it very often, and I'd kind of carry that guilt around all day. So instead, now I got this ridiculous hourglass offline, and now I turn the hourglass over, and I have 3 turns of it, so it's an hour each. And once the hourglass is done, I put it down for the day. But I'm not on deadline right now, so I can afford to be a little bit more quirky with it. But I find that's a good way, like 3 hours, not focus completely on it. And by the time and that 3 hours or 4 hours is done, I'm exhausted because you're just, how often do you literally focus all your mental energy onto one thing? And I find that it's very difficult for me to multitask. And if you look at the brain the way Freud did, you got your consciousness, which is, what we're doing right now, we're engaging in. And then you got your subconscious, which is kind of, that when you're writing or doing a task and you're flowing, but you're not even like consciously sure, like you're not consciously doing it. You're kind of just in the flow. That's subconscious. Then you got the id, which informs everything, right? I think that, when you have all this technology around, you're floating on that conscious level and you're too analytical of what you're doing. You're peeling back the layers. You're seeing the bullshit. You're seeing the cracks in it. But if you get to that subconscious level and you're just flowing, I mean, that's what I'm always trying to get to is how can I do that? But not in like 15-minute increments. That's why I try and do the hourglass. So do it for 3 hours, then you're out and you've done all the work. But otherwise, it's like 5 minutes of like Instagram, 15 minutes of writing, 2 minutes of checking email. Then that spawns a task of like 15 minutes of responding to email and then 15 minutes of writing. And that's a ridiculous way to live.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt that that's a trap. So if you get into the flow of writing and you're at your typewriter and you get to the end of that 3 hours, you just keep going?
Yeah, if I'm feeling it. I might go pour myself a nice whiskey and come back just so my words are a little spicier.
One of the aspects of Red Rising, the whole series, is that it's very heavy on dialogue. And that strikes me as a very particular skill to have to be writing dialogue. And I wanted to ask you, how does that differ from your other types of writing? And how do you get better at it?
Well, dude, it's almost all dialogue. So Red Rising is first person POV, right? So everything you see, be it a sunset on Luna, the moon, or getting stabbed or having a cup of tea, it's all seen through through the narration of the protagonist, right? And so that's all dialogue. It's all conversational. And so in many ways, the entire thing has to have a flow to it. So it all has to have like kind of almost like poetic meter. At least that's what I try to do. Like Darrow, for instance, is short, long, short, long. And so he'll have like two compact sentences or compact ideas and then a long one following it. Not all the time, but that's kind of taken from the iambic pentameter, which most of the the old Greek poetry like the Iliad and the Odyssey are based off because they're meant to be read aloud. So I've first started writing quietly, but now I basically am talking the entire time I'm writing, which causes my girlfriend like severe stress because she always thinks I'm talking to her. But the weird thing is I write in a British accent. So it's ridiculous, but a really bad British accent. And I'm like, and I'm kind of grumbling under my voice. So it all kind of sounds inaudible. So I sound like kind of Jeremy Irons in the corner, just being like, rah, rah, rah. And she's actually British. So I'm not sure why I want to write in a British accent. So, but I recently only discovered that a couple weeks ago and I like called her like frantically and I'm like, babe, I write in a British accent. And she's like, yeah, obviously you just figured this out. And I'm like, oh God. Yeah, I didn't know I'd say for about 6 months, I wasn't aware that I was talking while I was writing. Cause he kind of just turned like, I am not like a Stephen King. Stephen King, I feel like is very workmanlike about it, very professional about his writing. I'm kind of like I feel like I'm kind of like a madman. I'll be like, I'll run into the room, babe, I just wrote an Iron Rain, which is guys getting shot out of honeycomb like rail guns and spaceships to invade a planet. And I'll like take her through it and then I'll be like, all right, I'm going to go write more. And she just sits there and she hasn't said anything. Then she'll look back down at her book. So that's my household.
That's hilarious. So do you jump around when you write? It sounds like you do, that if there's a scene that inspires you, that's where you start. Or do you just really start at the beginning and work your way to the end?
I used to do that. And what I do now is I'll write like I kind of have to have a firm foundation in the beginning. Like first 100 pages are crucial. Like for me in the Red Rising series, there's always by page 100, there's a paradigm shift in the books. And so it's like the story you think you're reading just pivoted. And that's what's exciting. That's why I like writing from the seat of my pants because I get it surprised too. But for me, it's jumping around is kind of key because you got to maintain that internal animus, that internal excitement. And so I pop around to scenes I want to write. Although I try not to get too far afield because then you're just writing islands that don't make any sense. And so you have to have that framework that connects them. But certainly if there's a scene that excites me, I'll pop to it and then retrace my footing. But more often than not, I'll pop forward maybe just a chapter or half a chapter. And then I'll be like, oh, okay, so the rest of this chapter has to have this in it. Because the whole point of the chapter is getting to that scene. But often you can write too much filler and your book then gets boring. And you're just writing like Federico said, you're just writing like the dialogue, because the dialogue I get so excited about, but often I have too much dialogue. So I'm like, all right, this 6-page scene of dialogue doesn't necessarily matter because we're trying to drive to this point. So I'll write the point and be like, oh, okay, so these are the 3 pages that don't matter. So it's a great way of creating clarity. Like when I talk to you about finding my second draft of themes, well, I do that because I didn't know necessarily the story I was telling in the first draft because I don't have a plan as much. And then it all starts getting refined. So when you're skipping ahead in the first draft to write a new scene, well, then you kind of figure out the story you're writing a bit more, and it informs your writing to get to that point.
Sure. Does that help you keep from getting stuck as well, or do you still get stuck anyway?
I get stuck all the time. I have like writer's block that can happen at any time and last for any amount of time.
Yeah. How do you deal with that?
If I had an answer, I would have been finished with Dark Age 6 months ago. I think it's really silencing all the external voices. So when I talk about getting off the social media or off of Reddit, it's because I'm getting pulled in too many directions, and instead I just need to find out not what's right, but what's true to the story. And so for me, it's really finding out the true path, and that can only really be felt. You can't really logically explain it to yourself. It's kind of like when you're building something and you're like, this is how it should look like, but if you told your friend, you invite your friend over to look at your construction project or whatever, and you tell them what it's going to look like, it never ends up looking like that. It ends up looking what you figure out it's going to look like when you're doing it. And that's kind of my path, I guess.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by Astropad Studio. Astropad Studio turns your iPad into a completely customizable graphics tablet. With Astropad, you can combine the power of the Apple Pencil with your favorite Mac apps right on your iPad. The makers behind Astropad understand that no two artists work alike. That's why they've packed Astropad with opportunities to customize every aspect of your workflow, with features like programmable gestures, custom pressure curves, and unlimited per-app shortcuts. They literally designed Astropad from the ground up for professional artists. Astropad also guarantees low latency performance over Wi-Fi or a USB cable, so you can set up your workspace on the go. It's a high-performance tool for the most demanding creative work. And today, Astropad is used by major animation studios and product design firms across the globe. So, if you're ready to take your creative workflow to the next level, you can start your free 30-day trial of Astropad Studio today. Visit astropad.com to get started. Again, that's astropad.com to get started. Our thanks to Astropad Studio for their support of Dialogue.
So this is a question that we've asked all of our guests on this first season of Dialogue. What do you think is the role of hard work and luck, or maybe privilege? All of these different factors. What kind of role do you think they've played in your career so far?
Well, they play a crucial role in everyone's career. My career is just different because there's less people who get lucky. And, there's a lot of people that get lucky in real estate. A lot of people get lucky in business or, law or other things. But music, the arts in general, books, just far fewer people because the market isn't as big. Yeah, you look at Hollywood, right? 11 billion box office receipts. But that's a trifling amount when you look at, the profits of a company like Exxon. And so there's just a lot less opportunities there. So I think that luck has to play a part in it. Because look at Star Wars. Star Wars is awesome, but we're lucky that it got made. Because if you've ever looked at how it got made, it was like, it could have been a disaster. So luck always plays a part of it. Privilege always plays a part of it because I was privileged to have parents that encouraged me. I was privileged to have like places that I could actually live in rent free and write until I moved out of the house at 21 or 22. So that's that kind of the extent of it. But in terms of privilege in other ways, I mean, when you submit a book, they don't know who you are. They don't know what you look like. They don't know anything about you except your book. So my book got bought when they didn't know anything about me. So the book survives on its own merits. But how it got there is off a foundation of parents who were very helpful to me in terms of, giving me the space to write and then encouraging me. They're not like, they're readers themselves, but neither one reads books like I write. But we always had books in the house. So that's another privilege, right? But all that stuff starts getting hard to calculate because, there's a lot of people who have books in the house who don't become writers. So I think it plays a part, but not like certain other career paths where you're promoted because of who you are or because of the privilege that you might have within your society, being a certain type of person. It really is a blind test for what book, because the book stands on its own. I don't read a book because of its author. I read a book because other people like it,
All right, let's switch back to the books. So Iron Gold, set 10 years after the events of Morningstar. Darrow's still busy with this war, and really we get to understand the consequences of what it means to destroy an empire and build a republic. And Darrow is not the main protagonist anymore, and instead you switch to this multiple points of view system. And that to me, when I found that out as a reader, it felt like a very bold approach.
Mm-hmm.
I was skeptical of it.
Yeah, I bet you were skeptical. I bet.
I was skeptical of it initially, and I won't lie, it took me a few chapters to sort of get into that rhythm. But I mean, personally speaking, I love it. Still, I do feel like I can only imagine that for you, that must have felt like a huge risk. So I wanted to ask you how you approached, this decision, this change.
So there's always, when we're talking about different sides of the industry, it is important because there's some people out there that say, oh, I only care about the art. Well, okay, maybe you do, but for me, it's always like you have to balance the business side of things, you have to balance the artistic side of things, you have to balance the personal side of things. And I wasn't interested. I was once the original trilogy got popular, I realized I just wanted to be a writer. That's all I wanted to do. But I didn't want to write more books in the Red Rising series unless I really felt like I had something to say about it. And I told the story in the first three. It's the fall of an empire, basically. And it's archetypal, and we've seen that story before. But what I hadn't seen done well and what I hadn't seen become popular is the aftermath of what happens to the fledgling republic once they win. Because the story of the underdog is so much easier to tell. Instead, I wanted to look at the other side of things and see, all right, so we had this Darrow. Darrow is a character who upturned the status quo and current social order and has completely, revolutionized his society. But the entire time he was doing it, he was warned by the evil rulers, if you want to call them evil, we'll just call them the enemy. The enemy warned him that doing so and breaking their grip on society would unleash chaos. Well, I wanted to see that come true because it does come true. Because if you look at Arab Spring, if you look at the condition of a lot of countries that have gone through violent upheaval, that's the beginning of their tale. It's the beginning of the trauma. Much of the trauma comes in the years afterwards. But I didn't want it to be purely literary like that. I wanted also to explore the characters that Darrow had touched incidentally through his campaign for justice and see the negative externalities of a violent war. Because otherwise these books are just kind of military propaganda. And what I wanted to explore is the lives of three characters who Darrow had either met in passing or had not met at all and see how they've been affected. Because that's what war does. War affects everything in unforeseen ways, these ripple effects, right? And when looking for another way into the story, that seemed like the only logical way for me to go is, okay, I created this archetype. Now, how can I deconstruct it, but maintain it the same feeling, the same vibe, the same world that we're in, and not jeopardize that, the cozy feeling of hanging out with Severo and the Howlers and Darrow and the Howlers. And it's sort of like, okay, so you have Hogwarts, you have the Millennium Falcon, you have Minas Tirith, these kind of cozy places in your mind's eye that are somehow sacred to the reader. And what I wanted to do was not lose that majesty, that weird feeling of belonging that exists in a book, but also challenged the entire concept of the first books and what they fell in love with. So going to these other characters, super risky, but, and also not necessarily the catharsis readers want. Readers probably would have preferred if I followed Severo, Mustang, and Victra, some of the main characters around Darrow, if I was going to do other POVs. But then we're just following Golds around. We're just following the rulers, the master class. And to me, that feels antithetical to the entire reason I wrote Red Rising. It's antithetical to the entire construct of the world. So in many ways, readers have to adjust their expectations when reading these new books and trust me that I'm taking them towards the right place, because the Dark Age is a book about frustration. Like the entire thing is about frustration. So as a reader, you're supposed to feel frustrated reading it. When Darrow does something he wouldn't have done in the original books, well, he's 10 years older. He's 10 years more jaded. He's 10 years more frustrated. He's desperate. He's desperate to have a life besides war. Yet when he tries to take shortcuts, some people accuse him of being foolish or being too violent. And I'm like, okay, if Darrow's too violent, who have you been watching this whole time? The guy is a straight up murder machine. Yet you don't question it because he's murdering people that you think he should murder. But I want people to start looking at, why does he murder these people? And should he have murdered that person in Iron Gold? And when you start thinking of it like that, what it all of a sudden does to me is it makes the world more real, because then when he does go against someone who he has righteous conflict with, oh man, it means so much more. Oh man, it means that he's finally on the right path, and it has thematic resonance instead of just the hero doing what a hero does, which is kill the enemy. And for me, it was a way of creating more thematic resonance to the actual thing. Can this beautiful idea of hope and justice and equality and egalitarian society stand up to the scrutiny of 3 more books exploring it, the scrutiny of 10 years of strain and stress and fractured political parties, and really hold itself up by its own virtues, not by sacrificing its virtues upon the altar of necessity? So that's what these books mean to me and the why I went that direction.
So would you say that having this 10-year gap was one of the biggest challenges in sort of trying to understand, we have this character in the first trilogy, and now it's 10 years later, I need to sort of rethink this character, or maybe understand how this character might have grown? Just wonder what were some of the challenges there?
I think a lot of it is how do you make someone without showing it 10 years? So the characters, the end book 3 at about 23 years old. Now they're 33. The main characters are, and everyone else's age as well. How do you show their evolution of their character to be familiar and understandable change without taking you through almost like a history lesson of all the changes that happen, of all the things that happen, of all the events that happen? Because then that's just a lot of exposition. We want to live with the characters. We want to see through their eyes, because as a POV, that's what we're doing. We're seeing through the eyes of the character. So how is even their internal dialogue changed? Like the writing style of Darrow is even different from the other. Each book has Darrow talking almost in a different style as the styles continue to evolve. Fortunately, it mirrors my style as a writer, because Darrow, I wrote him when I was 22, and now I'm 33. I'm 31. God, I can't even keep track. I'm 31, and now Darrow's 2 years older than me. And fortunately, I've been able to grow up with him. So as Darrow's become more jaded, I've become more jaded. But as Darrow's also become more soulful, I've hopefully become more soulful as a person and understand things better. And so, showing it is easier than trusting the reader to see it. Sometimes I'll think that the reader can't see what I'm trying to show, but then I back up a little bit and be like, oh, okay, I don't have to belabor the point. The readers are clever. They'll figure it out. And so it's kind of trusting things to exist off the page more. Because with any book, the first book in a series that, opens up a world like, Harry Potter or Chronicles of Narnia or Fellowship of the Ring, there's a certain innocence there that isn't there after you've done several books in the series. So how do you maintain that feeling, that magical feeling of a distant world without still being able to rely on that innocence of exploration and this novelty of newness that exists in the first books? So that was also a big challenge, is maintaining, that feeling of magic without, retreading the old steps.
Yeah. And Mustang is a new point of view in Dark Age.
Oh yeah. She'll be fun.
What can you share about that without spoiling anything?
Well, Darrow's war is a physical war. Usually it's on distant battlefields. And in this one, you'll get to see Darrow's war. But you also get to see Mustang's war, which is handshakes and secret arrangements and lies. And so you'll get to see the political innards of the Republic and her fight to uphold them against, well, even some of the ill-conceived strategies of her close confidants. So in many ways, this book is the junction of all the different wars that are going on. The war of the small people, Lyria. The war of the juggernauts, Darrow, Atalantia, and the gold military machine. The war of the politicians through Mustang. And the war of the rejects through Ephraim. And then the war of the, how do I say this, reinvigorated society through Lysander. And Lysander is the counterpart to Darrow in this book. He was in the first trilogy, he was a youngster, like 9 or 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And he's grown up in this one. It's about him. How does the heir of an empire grow up when he doesn't necessarily agree with all of the moral failings of the empire that existed, but he also doesn't agree with the chaos that's been unleashed on the society, on the civilization. So what does he do? And so it's basically seeing the war through all these different perspectives.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by Hello. Have you ever tried a buckwheat pillow? I know I have, and I really like it a lot. It's fantastic. I've got a Hello pillow that the fine folks at Hello sent me about 9 months ago, and I've been using it every single day since then, and I bought a second for my wife. They're super comfortable. They mold to your head and neck so that you get just the right comfortable support, and they're cool. They don't get super hot. You know, I had a pillow that was a feather pillow beforehand, and I used to find myself folding it up to get the right thickness and support, or I'd be flipping it in the night because I was looking for the cool side because it would get a little hot in the summertime. But that doesn't happen with a Hello pillow at all. It's absolutely comfortable. And the insides are filled with buckwheat hulls. What that means is you can unzip the cover and take some out if you don't like the thickness of the one they send you. I haven't had an issue with that. I like the thickness just the way it is. But if you want to make it a little thinner, you can just take some out. You can also take them out when you want to wash the case. It's super, super convenient. Buckwheat pillows are something that have been used for centuries in places like Japan. And they're also on the menus of super fancy hotels that have pillow menus. I haven't been to one of these, but if you ever go to a fancy hotel with a pillow menu, I bet you'll find a buckwheat pillow. These are so incredibly comfortable, and I want to tell you about a deal that Hello's got just for our listeners. You can sleep on a Hello pillow for 60 nights. That's plenty of time to figure out whether you like it or not, and if it turns out you don't, you can just return it and they'll give you a complete refund. But I bet you'll love it. It's made right here in the United States. And to let them know that you came from this show, use the URL hellopillow.com/dialogue. That's HULLO pillow.com/dialogue. If you try more than one pillow, you can get a discount of up to $20 off per pillow, depending on the size that you get. There's also fast free shipping on every single order. And 1% of the proceeds go to the Nature Conservancy, which is a fantastic cause. All right. That URL again is hellopillow.com/dialogue. Go there today to learn more. Our thanks to Hello for their support of Dialogue.
You described Dark Age as not only the largest book you've ever done, but also the most complex and violent, and I'm quoting here, and hopefully intimate of the entire series. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it started off being like 1,200 pages, and we just pared it down. So now it's around 800 pages. And that is by far the longest book I've written. I mean, Red Rising was barely 350, maybe even less than that. And the new scope was demanded by the themes I'm playing with and to do justice to all the characters and story, because there's 5 POVs, which may or may not have been a good idea, but I was in it. I had 5 POVs, and I ended up writing, and I write them all separately, then join them all up. So they ended up being 5 different novels. Literally, each one of them could be a young adult novel length, because young adult novels are usually 80,000 words. And so what you have are 5 novels, and how do you mingle them together? So when I mean most violent, it's, the most explicit investigation of violence as a theme in my books. I think it's kind of like Cormac McCarthy does it really well. David, who did Eastern Promises? David Cronenberg does it really well on screen. So violence here is depicted almost, with a mind of its own. Intimate in terms of like the characters really bond with regard to the situations they embark upon, because it's a lot of unlikely pairings and seeing then how they find similarities in each other, strength in each other, weakness in each other, etc. And then just pure scope. We have 5 characters over a solar system wide conflict that makes World War II seem like a small affair. And the battles have to mimic that, but also the politics has to mimic that. But how do you make that, how do you make a huge battle matter? Well, you got to then use your magnifying glass, get down into it and get really nitty gritty with the characters. And that's what I mean by intimate. So in order to have this huge scope, you also have to have a very narrow lens for a lot of the character interactions so that it all matters.
Given this difference in scope and in perspective of this book, how did the process of actually writing it differ compared to the first trilogy?
Oh God, man. Have you guys ever heard of the writing program called Scrivener?
Yes.
Yes.
So Scrivener is a mixed blessing. I've written every book on Microsoft Word until this book, and Microsoft Word has a linear progression of thought. So basically, you're writing a book, and the pages all stack up. It's chronological. The pages all stack up, and so you got to remember where things are. And so, you eventually are able to be like, you can scroll wildly and find exactly the page you need to edit, or you get really intimate with Control F and searching through your document. And that's part of a process which I got rid of when I got Scrivener, which allows you basically to create thumbnails and pop around chapter to chapter, scene to scene with the click of a mouse.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is that gives you almost too much of a God's eye view. I benefit off of ignorance. I write best in ignorance. But the problem is, instead of, you're able to have this kind of omnipotent, omniscient view of the book, and then you're indicting what you're writing too much. So it slowed down the process quite a bit, which is unusual. So I may or may not use Scrivener again, simply because it allowed me to be too organized. So, what I would do is basically write each section, because what makes these books complicated is that all the character arcs affect everyone else's character arcs and affect the overall progression of the story.
Sure.
So when you're ping-ponging back and forth between 5 people, you got to keep the chronology right. Like, say this moon has been invaded. Well, you got to make sure that they're all doing making character decisions based on that moon having been invaded, or how they would gain access to that information, or when they would get access to that information. Or all these people are constantly functioning under false assumptions, which happens in wartime because you can't get in contact with anyone. And so they're all functioning off of these false assumptions, thinking that someone is going to bring troops here, or someone is going to come relieve the siege at this planet. But that may or may not be information that's 80 pages old, but that character hasn't come in contact with it yet. So I write all these characters by themselves. I'll have like 2-month period where I write Ephraim, or 3-month period or month period where I write Darrow. And then you're kind of just guessing, and then you got to sync it all together in like one intense night focus. You have to sync them together and then slowly start layering them in and making sure the information is distributed the way you need it to be. And also so that characters aren't revealing like plot arc twists of a different character. So it's pretty convoluted. After this series, I might not do multiple POV narrators again. It's so hard.
Yeah, that really sounds complicated. And I know the Scrivener is kind of designed to deal with that sort of thing, but are there other tools that you've used to try to keep those sorts of, timelines and relationships between characters together?
Yeah. I use a big chalkboard. So I painted one of my walls completely in chalkboard black. And so I have like the hardest thing for me to keep track of, because, think about Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is really sophisticated, right? Extremely hard to keep track of all the characters. But the landmass is never moving. Now, imagine you're doing this in the solar system with 23 spheres, moons, and planets that are populated, and they're constantly rotating around each other at different speeds. And so I try to keep track of that, and then I kind of abandoned that altogether because it came too difficult. Because, say for instance you're going to invade Mercury from Earth, or from Earth's moon Luna,
right?
Well, okay, there's so many different times you can invade Mercury based on where its position is relative to Earth in its orbital pattern. Right. But the problem is, if Venus is controlled by an enemy and that's between you and Earth, well, then that enemy could while you're transiting to Mercury, ambush you, depending on Venus's movement. But also, if they're using the gravitational pull of Venus, they could slingshot across Venus while it's coming across the orbital path you've taken and ambush you at far higher speed and velocity than you have. So there's a lot to take into account, especially when you're trying to do it with the characters, like trying to come up with a strategy that is also not boring or impossible to, you know, attack a planet. So there's so many different ways to for a plan to go wrong, or to, you know, judge when you should do an event. Like, should you go after Mercury when it's closest to when it's right opposite the sun? So you basically slingshot off of, use Venus, the enemy's stronghold, slingshot off of it, you know, far orbit, and then zip past the sun, and then go to Mercury while it's on the far side. There's just so many things like that you just have to, you know, eventually just make a decision, or like not even think about, because it becomes too difficult. So, you know, visually, I can only keep track of that by having it on the blackboard, where everyone is and stuff like that. And Scrivener is good at keeping track of things, but it slows down the actual writing and the actual typing.
Well, that sounds amazing. Like I had a feeling that you would have to keep track of all of this, but you know, hearing it from you is just, that sounds incredible. You know, having to deal with.
I don't know, man. If you're OCD, I would not recommend writing a space book where you're accurately trying to keep track of the planets. If I do another space book, it'll be like Star Wars, where I'll just be like, they're skipping back and forth through wormholes, because then you don't have to deal with the actual travel. You know, keeping, because I'm like, you know, one book I'm like, it takes, at near orbit, it takes four weeks to get from the asteroid belt to Mars. All right, so now that's a lot. Near orbit, that has to happen. So far orbit, I have to come up with, you know, how fast are they going in near orbit for that to be possible. So then at far orbit, it takes like 7 weeks. You know, but then if you're like the Rim, which is another society kind of in the Red Rising books, and you're, you know, sending spaceships to attack the Republic on Mars or something, well, you're going to wait and you're going to do it in like March when they're the closest to you.
And this is all hypothetical, right?
No, this is all hypothetical. But then of course the Republic and the Martians aren't stupid, because I've created a society based off of, you know, the physically supreme and the most intellectual savvy rise within it. So then these people actually have to be intellectually savvy, right? I can't just have them all be dumb. So then, of course, then the people on Mars would know that that's the time they're closest and most vulnerable to attack. So then they would deny them the opportunity to do that. So when would be the tricky time to do that? So it's like all these like different possibilities and theories. So I'm trying to get inside the minds of the rulers of these societies and figuring out it'd be so damn hard to fight an interstellar war. So next time, just wormholes and instant traveling.
Yeah, that sounds convenient. So I tried, before we wrap up the show, so I tried really hard, and I feel like my restraint should be appreciated here as a fan, not to ask you anything specific. But
I appreciate your restraint that you're now going to lose completely.
No, okay. So my final question would be, what is your hope? What do you hope the readers take away from Dark Age? The book comes out July 30th, which, you know, thanks to the magic of podcasting, would be today as you're listening, or I guess the week before. But we're doing this in early July, so the book isn't out yet. What do you hope readers will take away from the new book?
I hope that it challenges their initial assumptions about Iron Gold, you know, the way they thought the story was going or the path I was taking on it, but also challenges their assumptions in the original series, things they took for granted, or the cost of warfare that they, you know, were only too eager to assume. And also the characters, who's good and evil and why. And so I hope that this throws their expectations into conflict, and that they enjoy it. And it's nothing's in there just to screw with them, but that it makes them, makes the story more enriched in their minds, because it's different than what the path they thought I was going on with it. So hopefully it defies expectations. That's all I'm hoping for it. Without, like, you know, cheating or subverting their trust. Because, you know, to come with me, usually, let's be honest, usually there's 3 books in a series, like a trilogy, and then if they add more, they usually suck. They're usually not great. No follow-ups to trilogies or follow-ups to series are usually not very good. And I hope that this one is, you know, in their minds, very good. So that's kind of the onus of this book to me, was to make sure that it doesn't, fall prey to all the problems of writing things that aren't part of the original story.
Thanks so much, Pierce. I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been fantastic talking to you. This has been a really interesting conversation.
I appreciate you guys letting me wander and ramble. I sometimes do that. So, after, it's a perfect thing to do after 4th of July to get back into it. So now I did my drink and I did my party, and now back to the grindstone.
Sounds great. Where can people follow your work if they want to follow you online?
Best way is the social media platforms. So, Pierce Brown Official on Instagram, Pierce_Brown on Twitter, and Pierce Brown on Facebook. The Google search engine on Facebook is good enough for you to find me.
Okay, and you can find, of course, me and Federico over at macstories.net, and Federico and I are both on Instagram and on Twitter. Federico is at Viticci, that's Viticci, and I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.